Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the study of antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and today we are joined by a very special guest, and that is PhD student Theodore Nash. Mr. Nash, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nick. It's great to be here.
We have an excellent presentation for you today, and that is the history of the Kingdom of Pylos. And so, Theo, I'd like to start off by asking, what are the etymological origins of the term Mycenae?
All right, Nick, that's an interesting question and gets to one of the interesting aspects about Greek prehistory and one of the difficulties of studying it. So Mycenae is the name that we give to this region in the southwestern Peloponnese in Greece. And it's the name we give it to really in the historical period. It's a region which is conquered by Sparta. It supplies their Helot population, their slaves, their agricultural workers, so the population that really supports the Spartan military industrial complex, if you will. And so it's a region that is also heavily populated in the Bronze Age, but we don't really see it given the name Mycenae there. And what it seems like happened is that there's a city called Mycenae, and it's right close to modern Kalamata, and this appears to be the major center of Mycenae in the historical period, but it's not the major center of Mycenae in the Bronze Age. But in the Bronze Age, it's Pylos, the palace of Nestor, so-called because of where Nestor and the Homeric poems come from. So Mycenae is a type of name that we find around Greece, and it's a little bit, the way the language changes over the years kind of obscures its connection, but it's actually a name of the same type as Athens and Mycenae. So the modern capital of Greece, as well as Mycenae, which the sort of most important Bronze Age site in Greece, which we'll be talking about later. And so all of these start off as names that end in ana. So Messana, Mukana, Athana, and then as history goes on, we get from that, and the letters get changed in how they get pronounced, and they get pluralized, and we end up with Mycenae and Athenae. But this ending to a name is not something that we find in the Greek language. It's not something we can interpret based on what we know about ancient Greek. So what it seems like we're dealing with in this situation is that Greece, the first people in Greece were not the Greek speakers. And this makes perfect sense. Greek is an Indo European language, and so the people who spoke it must have come from wherever Indo European speakers came from. We think probably the Caucasian steppe, modern Ukraine. And obviously the movement of language is not necessarily the large scale movement of people either, but this language has to come from somewhere into Greece at a later date. So what happened is that whenever Greek arrived, there was already a language being spoken, and this makes perfect sense too, because we know that the Minoans on Crete were also speaking a different language. So these names that we find throughout Greece are not actually Greek names, you might say. They're something that exists from an earlier stratum of history. So the names in Greece, some of them are very, very old, right? We're talking the Greeks perhaps arrived 4,000 years ago, and these names that we're still using are names that probably go back to even before that. So that's the depth of history gets really overwhelming really quickly.
And so we discussed earlier the arrival of the Indo Europeans into Greece, and you mentioned a population that would have already have been there. And so my question is, what do we know about the earliest inhabitants of the region itself?
That's a good question. So in Mycenae itself, we don't know a tremendous amount. There are other parts of Greece that are much more, where we have much more extensive archaeological remains from an early period. And I should say that it's very difficult to pinpoint when the Greek language arrives in Greece. And this is because language and identity are things which can change even for the same person, right? You can be born in one place, move to another, and end up speaking a different language and having a completely different identity by the time you're an adult, and have kids who then adopt that identity too. So these things aren't genetically determined, and you don't need to have large-scale population movements in order to explain the movements of languages or of cultures. People pick up on new things for whatever reason, and it's not always clear why. And this is one of the biggest problems in interpreting the arrival of the Greeks, right? We know that Greek speakers have to get to Greece because we call it Greece. And I mean, why we call it Greece is a whole different question. But the language and that language is still spoken there today. So we have to get to that point. And so for a long time, archaeologists thought it was possible to figure this out. So in the early Bronze Age, in the third millennium BC, especially northeast of where we are in Mycenae, up in the Argolid, the plain of Argos, in the northeastern Peloponnese, we have a few sites, especially Lerna, which later passes into legend as a place where Heracles will fight the Lernaean Hydra. So it's a swampy area, and the Hydra is sort of a watery creature. And so you can see how this connection comes out. And so at Lerna, we have something from the early Bronze Age, the third millennium BC, called the House of the Tiles, which appears to be some sort of administrative center. From the third millennium BC, we have a lot of seals and sealings from it. So we clearly have records and accounting of goods coming in and out, and trade goods and things like this. And then it gets burned down right at the end of early Helladic II, I think. So sort of near the end of the third millennium BC, and then doesn't really get rebuilt. And sort of what we start to see at the site afterwards is a little bit different. And so we have a few of these sort of burnt destructions in early Helladic II, and then we start to find slightly different types of pottery developing in early Helladic III. And so for a long time, archaeologists thought that you could sort of tie this all together. You could say, all right, we have these destructions, then we have these new types of pottery coming in. And so clearly this is when the Greeks arrived, because this is the easiest and clearest sort of break in the continuity, because Lerna never really becomes an important center again. There's still stuff there, and there's some interesting things, but the significance definitely changes. We don't really think this anymore. The problem with tying things together in the third millennium BC using archaeological dates, which are mostly derived from how pottery styles change, is that the best we can do in a lot of cases is something like a 50-year period, right? And that's a whole human generation. So even if you're tying things together within that, you're not necessarily tying events together. It's very hard to use archaeological data to write history, because history depends on the movements of people, movements of individual people. Right, like if all we had were like archaeological remains of Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, we know next to nothing about Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, right? This is just not what archaeology is good at telling us. And so nowadays, scholars, they've kind of stepped back from the question. It's not a question that we think is necessarily particularly interesting, or even if it is interesting, it's a very, very difficult one to answer. And our evidence doesn't give us, the evidence we have is not the evidence we would need to answer this question. So all we can say is that at some point, people who spoke the language that we now call Greek arrived in Greece, or the language itself arose. I mean, we can say things like the language arrived, but realistically that means somebody who spoke the language had to arrive, or people in Greece were meeting people who spoke this language, right? Languages, and it's an important thing to remember when dealing with archaeological evidence, is that nothing ever moves without people being involved, right? Languages, writing, pottery, people have to go around, and like these things don't move on their own, right? We don't have robots. So the language arrives in some form or other, perhaps a smaller population of speakers who then somehow develop a certain amount of cultural cachet, and then other people want to speak the language. It's very, very hard to model how this may have happened, but basically what is pretty certain is that the Greek language arrives, and it's not, people used to say that as a population movement, a population replacement, the Greek speakers come in, they kill all the natives, very sort of, North American settler colonialist. We don't think that anymore. Maybe, there's probably battles, there's probably fighting, right? Like the ancient world could be a pretty brutal place, but it's not going to be widespread. It doesn't make sense to kill everyone and then try and replace them, because then right? Like these kind of, when you sort of think through the implications of burning down all this cities in a place where you arrive and killing all the people and then just repopulating based on you and your friends who came in on their chariots with you, like that's not the greatest model for developing a city, right? That's not how urbanism works. And it's the same, right? You run into problems like the story of Rome and the myth of the Sabine women, where we have all these Roman men hanging out. They have no women to have children with, so I have to go and steal them from a neighboring village, which, man, this isn't how history works. Maybe that reflects intermarriage and things like this, which is how history works, but not, you don't have these large populations just of men who've killed everyone and then have to try and resettle. very dramatic. Okay, so I think we've been sidetracked a bit from the question about what archaeology can tell us about the earliest inhabitants in Greece. So the earliest inhabitants in Mycenae, we don't know a huge amount about them because Mycenae was not a region that had extensive habitation in this period. We know that things like farming started somewhere around the beginning of the Bronze Age, around 3000 BC, because we from pollen cores, so we can see what kind of plants are being cultivated. And we also have a few remains, so close to the palace in the city close to Pylos, in the city of Hora. Near there is a cave with late Neolithic remains, so something like 4th millennium BC. But in Mycenae, we don't know a huge amount about what's going on. And to be honest, it's not my area. So sort of these earlier periods, the Stone Age in Greece is really exciting, and there are some really, really cool sites. But I don't want to say too much because I don't want to say anything wrong. But definitely in Mycenae, really human habitation and serious urbanism and the state formation processes that we sort of see starting earlier in the Cyclades or on Crete, or even in the Argolid in the early Helladic period when we get things like Lerna, which I talked about. We don't see those earlier developments so much in Mycenae. It's not really so much until the 2nd millennium BC and the Mycenean culture, as we call it, starting to develop, that's when we start to really see major human activity in Mycenae.
In some of my earlier episodes with other experts, especially involving one of our latest episodes on the history of the Kingdom of Alatia, we find out that in early Cyprus, a variety of different migrations moved into Cyprus, mainly from Anatolia, the Levant, so on and so forth. And with these earliest populations, I was wondering if the original inhabitants of Greece, would there possibly, could we speculate, be a connection to the ancient Near East when it comes to migrations?
Yeah, we absolutely could. And so people have, like we talked about the name Mycenae, Messana, these early sort of pre-Greek place names. It's people have tried to tie these together with place names that we can see in Anatolia. And I think our best guesses as to the earliest, or to earlier population movements, do suggest that Greece was probably peopled from the Near East, people coming across the Aegean, probably rather than by land. But this is, I think, what we think, but it is a difficult area, and what's very likely is that we had multiple movements of people from different directions. So much gets, in Asia Minor itself, we're so much luckier in some ways because we have the extensive Hittite records, and we know about various populations. We know about the Indo European languages that are being spoken across Anatolia, and we know about the indigenous languages, which of course, are languages which originally came from somewhere else too, right? Like no one is ever truly indigenous to a place. Everybody comes from somewhere. And so, yeah, we all certainly have people coming from the Near East into Greece, but we could also have people coming from Europe in the north, and Crete in the south, Africa even further south, and putting all of these prehistoric pieces together. This is something which people try and do now with DNA studies. We can do ancient DNA. We can recover DNA from human remains going back into the prehistoric period. But this is really tricky too, because a DNA study, you only have so many people that you're going to be able to work with. We only have so many remains that survive. And so often you get these studies that come out and, they make these big claims and they say, wow, the Etruscans came from the Near East, which is something which people have been speculating about for a long time. But in fact, what these DNA studies sort of show is that 12 burials that we consider Etruscan and call Etruscan now show people who move from the Near East. But to extrapolate out from however many remains we can study to the whole population of the ancient world is very difficult.
We've talked a little bit about the writing system that's going to come into play. And so my question is, for right now, what do we know about possibly the original languages, including the incoming languages that are going to be spoken in this region?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And like I said, the original language. So one of the things to keep in mind is that, so we have these place names that we can't interpret, like Mycenae, underlying Mycenae, Athens, Mycenae, Knossos on Crete, all of these names, they don't make sense to us. But people don't name things at random. Right? Place names, rivers, they almost always have some underlying logic, right? So like the river Avon in England, going through Stratford, where Shakespeare is from, Avon is just a Celtic word for river, right? So it's the river, and they just called it the river because that's the river that mattered to them. So names always, place names and river names and all of these things tend to have a certain underlying logic. Just like if you were to find out about America 4,000 years from now and you see about this place, New York, you might, if you knew what new meant, you'd be able to guess that there's an old York. But if you didn't, you'd just be like, oh, what's this place, New York? Or New Jersey, all of these places. And of course, the same thing with so many Native American names, where I am in Michigan, we're surrounded by them. And if you don't know those languages, the connection of what the names mean to what you're looking at is entirely opaque. But once upon a time, there were people who lived in Greece who this made perfect sense to them, and these names meant something. We can't reconstruct that anymore, unfortunately. But it's always good to remember that these names, which we can see, what makes them interesting is that they were names that people gave to them and people used to understand the world around them. And so even though the people are gone, the name is still here. And even in this case, we've forgotten what the name means. But there are in other cases where we can sort of see, just being able to see what a name means. And this is especially meaningful when we get into the Greek world. If nothing else, even if you just have what that name means and what that name says, you're still getting at how people experience the world around them. So you can pull so much out of such small things. So earliest population is naming things, or an earlier population name than we don't know, right? There were people in Greece before the Greeks who weren't speaking Greek who were naming things, and we don't know how many people there were, how many languages were being spoken, possibly more than one, perhaps even probably more than one. But then at some point, we don't know when, the Greek language becomes a language that people use to communicate with each other. It probably never fully replaces these underlying languages. Just like you can think about the Norman invasion of England, right? The peasants, the normal people, they're still speaking English, whereas the nobility are speaking French. And so more people who are sort of aspiring to be socially mobile are going to also be speaking French. And this is where we get breakdowns in our own language, right? So we eat pig, but we eat pork because pig is the Anglo-Saxon name and pork is the French name. So the farmers are calling them pigs. The French people eating them are calling it pork. So something similar is probably happening. But the difficulty is that the records we have written in Greek reflect what the elites are doing. So we don't necessarily get so much whatever's happening beneath that. So to say a little bit about that. So the Greek language is what we call an Indo European language. And so this is this large language family, which extended sort of from England to India, and then now all across the globe in the sort of from the age of colonialism. And so Greek is originally related to this. So it's related to Latin, though even though they're close to each other, they're not related because they're close to each other. They're related because they both came from somewhere else. It's related to Sanskrit in India. It is related to English if you go back far enough, though it's so far that some of the connections are difficult to see. And so this language comes in and is probably, like I say, it's adopted by some people, probably not all. There's going to be a lot of bilingualism. This is one of the things that I think we always sort of underestimate, especially in the Anglosphere, right? Because it's so easy today to be monolingual. It's so easy today to only speak English and communicate with people because, an age of globalism, an age of sort of linguistic imperialism, if you want to call it that, it's so everybody else has to learn English. And so if you only speak English, it's so easy to go on only doing that. But the ancient world wasn't like that. And there were all kinds of languages and there was all kinds of mobility. People weren't just sitting in their huts thinking in Greek and, twiddling their thumbs all day when they're not out in the fields working. They had fully realized lives. They were traveling around. This is what we see when we talk about things like language movement or trade or any of these things. That reflects what people are doing in their daily lives. They're going about, they're interacting with each other. They're speaking in one language with one person, another language with another person. all of this. So Greek arrives at some point and becomes a language that people use to communicate. And like I say, it probably never fully replaces the old languages, but it's a language which people find useful. And so somehow, probably not with a large population movement, probably with a small population movement, people interacting with each other over generations, it slowly spreads across the country, so to speak, not a modern word, but it spreads across the region and then becomes the language that we start to see popping up when we do find writing in the mid to late second millennium BC.
And so as we come to these peoples moving into Greece during this time, they're going to come into contact with obviously the indigenous populations. And so my question is, now that they come in and they establish themselves, what kind of writing systems and possibly languages are we looking at?
So that's a great question. So a little bit earlier on the island of Crete, the people whom we call the Minoans, we don't know what they called themselves. This is a term that we have invented in the 19th century based on the legend of King Minos, the most famous Cretan who was the father of the Minotaur, of course, had the labyrinth built. So the Minoans on Crete, they'd been doing their own writing thing for a little while now. And it's quite an interesting story, actually. So they had at least two different writing systems, which seem to be closely related, and then a few other things like the Phaistos disc, which is very famous. And if you ever have a guest who tells you they've deciphered it, they're wrong. They haven't. It's impossible. When you only have one text in a script, there's no way to actually confirm a decipherment, right? Because you can't compare it with anything else. So you can say it says anything, but unless you have something else you can check it against, there's no way of knowing. So the Minoans had, alongside that, the Minoans had Cretan hieroglyphic, which is very pictographic. Looks, in that it's similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs, but it's not related to them at all as far as we can tell. And Linear A. And Linear A is the script which seems to be a little bit more widespread, especially in regions outside of Crete. And it's something that the Greek speakers, when they arrived in what we now call Greece, would have encountered. We have a few attestations of it from the mainland, though they didn't seem particularly interested in it, at least initially. But what looks to have happened is that in the 15th century BC, somewhere around 1500 probably, Mycenean Greeks from the mainland conquered the Cretan capital of Knossos. And it looks like, having done that and all of a sudden being in charge of a palace for the first time, they realized that it's actually quite useful to be able to write. And what they did is, it seems like they basically rounded up a bunch of the Linear A scribes who were still around. The context in which they took over is very unclear. You know, they may have been invited in to help. It may have been an aggressive takeover. It may have come through marriage and just general things over a couple generations. But at any rate, the culture at Knossos at this point starts to look a lot more like on the mainland. We start to find the same types of tombs, and the grave goods especially look very, very much like what we find at contemporary graves at Mycenae and Pylos. And what it looks like they did is they rounded up a bunch of Linear A scribes and said, hey, it's really cool what you guys can do. Could you do it in Greek? And so with really minimal changes, the script doesn't change a huge amount, but some of the way that they record weights and measures changes, and the way that they sort of lay out tablets becomes a little bit more clear and structured. They start to actually rule their tablets like lined paper you use in school. So the tablet, it's much easier to read. And they start using this system to write the Greek language and to run the administration of their kingdom, basically. We don't have any sort of historical or mythological texts, which is hard not to be a little bit disappointed by. Before this was deciphered, that's what everybody kind of hoped we would have. You know, Minos is famous in the tradition for his laws, Cretan laws, Minos and his brother Rhadamanthus and all of the judges of the underworld. And everyone was like, ooh, we're going to have Minos's law code the same way we found Hammurabi's law code in Mesopotamia. But unfortunately not. But what we have is still really interesting because it gives us an insight into the the way that these kingdoms were organized, the way that people lived their lives, how they interacted with the palace, how they interacted with each other. And it's a really rich source of information, even if it's not the antecedents of Homer that everybody were hoping for.
The upside is, as more archaeology is done, you never know what we could possibly find. So you may get your wish after all one day.
Yeah, and these are the kind of things that continue to be discovered. So I think starting in 2008, a new archive was found, and actually a whole new palace was found in Laconia, so near ancient Sparta. And so one of the problems for the Greek Bronze Age is that in Homer, obviously Sparta is an important center because this is where Menelaus is, this is where Helen is, this is where she's taken from, and everything starts. And for the most of the history of the discipline of what started as Homeric archaeology and has turned into Aegean prehistory, we haven't found anything matching that kind of description in Laconia. And it was a bit of an embarrassment, especially for people who want to see any kind of memory of Bronze Age events in Homer, that we didn't have this. And there were remains. There was a famous tholos tomb excavated in the 19th century at Vafio, and there was the Menelaon mansion, and but a centralized palace and a linear B archive were not to be found until, like I say, just over 10 years ago, they started turning this up, and they're still working on it now, and we're waiting they've published a little bit of it, but these things take a long time to come out. And so we're very much looking forward to the publication of the tablets and to the palace itself, which sounds like it's an incredible find.
And so when it comes to archaeology, what is archaeology telling us so far about these new arrivals who are settling themselves throughout the Aegean during this period, and especially at Pylos?
Again, it's very difficult to point archaeologically at the point when Greek speakers arrive. It used to be very popular, and we're still at a point where we know that Greek is an Indo European language. We know that it must have originated somewhere, that it could split into everything from Sanskrit in the East to the Anatolian languages to ultimately Celtic languages, Germanic languages, English. So the Greek language did not start in Greece. How it arrived in Greece is very unclear, but we know that it did, and it seems to have arrived in Greece by the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, probably a little bit before this, but we can't judge until we actually have writing to tell us. But what we start to see in Mycenae, so Mycenae is not a region in Greece that is particularly exciting from an archaeological perspective in the earlier Bronze Age or in the Stone Age. But what we start to see in the later Middle Bronze Age is we start to see actually the first attestations of some of the things that actually become very emblematic of what we call Mycenean civilization. So this is the place on the mainland. It seems to have a strong connection with Crete. So Crete, Minoan Crete, had a colony on the island of Kythera, which is just south of Laconia and very close to Mycenae. So they clearly had contacts coming up into the southwest Peloponnese. And it's in Mycenae in the late Middle Bronze Age that we find the first tholos tombs on the Greek mainland. And these are sometimes called beehive tombs because that's what they look like. They're sort of domed using a corbel vaulting technique. And they start off in Mycenae, sort of much smaller, but in Mycenae, we do get much bigger and more impressive ones later. And of course, this architectural form spreads across the Greek mainland, and we find its most impressive surviving form at Mycenae now in the treasury of Atreus, which you can still visit. It's an absolutely awe-inspiring site, with sort of a 15-meter diameter, 50, 55-foot meter diameter, still uncollapsed. The lintel stone is the largest in the world at 100 tons. The engineering feats that the Mycenaeans were capable of, especially in later periods by the end of the late Bronze Age, were just incredible. The ancient Greeks never really got that good at building with big stones ever again. And obviously, you can do a lot even if you don't use 100-ton stones. The Parthenon didn't need them, but the tradition records that the sites like Mycenae and Tiryns with these giant stone constructions were built by Cyclopses, by the Cyclopes, because the later Greeks just saw these giant stones and they couldn't move them. So it must have been done by giants. And this is kind of a fun cross-cultural thing too, because we have Anglo-Saxon poems from post-Roman Britain. And there's one poem called The Ruin, which seems to be about the Roman ruin at Bath. And they refer to it as the old work of giants. So this idea that all these old, and even Stonehenge has similar traditions about it, these old mythical traditions. So it's fun to see how people come up with these same stories over and over and over again. But all of those endpoints, the starting point for the Tholos tomb was in Mycenae. And there's some question as to whether it's related to earlier tombs found on Crete, which we also call Tholos tombs, but which are quite different. They're much smaller and they're fully above ground, whereas the Mycenaean form tends to be buried in the ground. Though some of these earlier Mycenaean ones are also built above ground. So there seems to be a bit of you can see the bridge there if you want to. Without sort of being able to ask the architects, it's very difficult to know how exactly, it's not rocket science to come up with, well, we want to build a round stone thing and put our dead people in it, especially when you have a tradition of tumulus burials, which we do have on the Greek mainland as well, and which, everybody everywhere has been able to come up with. It's kind of funny sometimes you hear archaeologists talk about the relationship of different cultures and say, well, they're using tumuli and these guys are using tumuli, so they must have been talking to each other or something like this. Like, well, it doesn't take every kid in a sandbox has built a big hill out of sand. And that basically is the principle of a tumulus, is you're just doing it on a bigger scale. So the idea that this is anything sort of meaningful is a bit of a laugh. But like I say, we have this idea of a round, raised sort of burial, and something which stands out in the landscape is something which we do have on the Middle Hellenic mainland. So we don't need the Cretan Tholos tomb to be the predecessor, but the fact that we have it and the fact that Mycenae does have these early Cretan connections is somewhat suggestive.
And so as they settle in and as the Kingdom of Pylos develops, let's talk society. What kind of society did they have?
It seems to be that there's a bit of a difference. So when we start seeing things in the late Middle Bronze Age, this seems to be part of what we tend to call the pre-palatial Mycenaean culture on the mainland. And this is a culture that is shared across the mainland in a lot of ways. It manifests in a similar way at Mycenae and at Pylos and elsewhere. And it's it's a culture which places great value on how people are buried. It's a culture, and so this is part of why it's famous, right? If you want your archaeological remains to survive untouched, the best way to do this is bury them already, because most things which are preserved because they're buried, and a lot of things are buried by accident. A palace burns down, and then you can recover what gets buried, but it's already burned down. But if you put something in the ground, unless someone comes along and finds it, it's going to stay there. And so, so we have the Tholos tombs, which already speak to this sort of the importance placed on funerary ritual, funerary pageantry, being buried in something which stands out in the landscape and having that visual and constant marker of, that's where dad's buried, that's where granddad's buried. So you have these strong sort of ancestral connections. And these early tombs, they were shared. So Tholos tombs, you don't go to all that trouble just to bury one person in it. You keep burying people in it. And so you get buried alongside your father and your grandfather. And so you have this constant connection with the past. And this is somewhere where we'd love to have more texts or something telling us about how the Mycenaeans conceived of, ancestor cult or something like this. We don't really have, we can do a lot with archaeology. When we have preserved remains, we can analyze them and see if the DNA shows that people are related. But other than that, we're just sort of piecing together pieces with informed conjecture. So we have these Tholos tombs. And Mycenia likes them. And the Myceneans like them, and they start building them bigger and bigger. And we get the first one we get at the actual site of Pylos is at the very, very end of Middle Helladic 3 or the very beginning of Late Helladic 1. And this is tholos tomb 4 at Pylos, which was excavated in the 1950s as part of Carl Blagen's Cincinnati expedition. And it's now been so the thing with tholos tombs is that if you build a really big stone dome, Greece is in a seismically active region. Eventually, the ground's going to wiggle a little bit, and your thing's going to fall over. So the number of tholos tombs which have actually survived uncollapsed, you could probably count them on one hand. The Treasury of Atreus at Mycenae is one of them, and the most impressive. There's another at Mycenae which survived undamaged for centuries until I think the 19th century when someone tried to loot it by going in through the top, which there's one at Tiryns, which is still uncollapsed. But most of them just inevitably collapse. And so when you find a new tholos tomb, often to excavate it, you have to dig through meters of collapsed stone. And so tholos 4 was found collapsed, but the Greek Archaeological Society has reconstructed it. So when you go to Pylos today, you park your car in the parking lot, and you can either turn right, and you can go and you can see the reconstructed tholos tomb 4, or you can go left to the palace. So it's really cool, and you can quibble over whether reconstruction is necessary, but it really does. It's not this. You can stand in a collapsed tholos, and you can sort of get a sense for how big it used to be. You can feel how far the walls are away from you, but it's not the same as being in one with the roof over you, and you can feel the weight of the earth, and that is how they're supposed to be. So we have tholos tomb 4, and then at the same time, it seems like they're starting to centralize. So obviously, if you're able to mobilize this much labor to construct tombs, then you have people, and you're able to put a lot of gold and things in them. Then you have people who have sort of centralized authority around themselves, are able to mobilize labor in society, are able to, at a basic level, tell people what to do, and have started to amass wealth for themselves. And so in Late Helladic 1, we get a fortification wall built around the site of Pylos. And we know there were buildings inside of it, but we don't really know what they look like because we have a later palace there. And the irony with archaeology is that you will always understand the best understood phase of a site is almost always going to be the last inhabitation phase. So we're lucky for places like Mycenae and Tiryns especially that they never really turned into major classical Greek centers. So the Bronze, and same with Pylos. So, it's not like in the 5th century they were running around building big temples on top of them. Athens, the Acropolis, seems to have had a Mycenaean palace on top of it. All right, we have Mycenaean remains from the Acropolis. There's a staircase that they cut down a cleft in the rock to get to water access. There's various things going on. But because Pericles went and funded the whole classical building program and put the Erechtheion right on top of where we think there may have been a Mycenaean palace, there's not a lot left to look at. And so early Mycenaean Pylos, the site itself, is not perfectly understood because we have the tholos tomb 4, we have remains of the wall, but everything inside of it, hard to see.
So we've covered that they have obviously a centralization of power. They obviously are making use of bodies using labor control by one means or another. And so what does that really show us about a possible hierarchical structure? Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
So one of the fascinating things about early Mycenaean culture in general and early Mycenaean Pylos, as we're really discoveries in the last 5 years are really changing how we understand early Mycenaean Pylos, is that it looks like we had some sort of oligarchy or aristocracy. It doesn't look like we had centralized authority under a single king yet, because we have so many wealthy burials. So if there is a king, he doesn't stand out archaeologically from the way he's being buried. Otherwise, it seems like we had a large ruling aristocracy who were all burying themselves in very similar ways and competing with each other in the way they were buried. And this has always been clear at Mycenae, especially. So in the end of the Middle Helladic period, they started burying, a certain family group started burying themselves in what we now call grave circle B, which is a grave circle is exactly what it sounds like. It may have had a bit of a tumulus covering, but there was certainly what we call a temenos wall, just a rock wall around it, or a peribolos. And they put shaft graves inside of this. And we know from, this was excavated in the 50s by the Greeks, and we know from analysis of the bones that a lot of the people buried here were related. Towards the end of that, but with a little bit of overlap, grave circle A came into use, which is the famous tombs that Schliemann excavated in the mid to late 19th century. So we know, and so these are going on at the same time. And then even at the end of grave circle A looks like a rival family who were also burying themselves in very, very, very rich ways, much richer than anything we see in grave circle B, but also later in time. So we can trace through grave circle B to grave circle A real development of the wealth that's being accrued at Mycenae. And then sort of as grave circle A is in use, we start to see tholos tombs popping up. And at the same time, we get chamber tombs, which we tend to think of as somewhat easier to build than a tholos tomb, but a lot of the chamber tombs at Mycenae are full of incredible wealth. Some of them are even built to look like tholos tombs. They try and carve them so they have the same shape. So what we see is what someone has called like a spiraling competition. Everybody's just trying to have the best tomb. Everyone wants to be buried with the best stuff and in the best way. And so it's still the case that this is most visible at Mycenae. But new discoveries at Pylos have really show us that this is happening there too. So we always used to know, we knew from the 1950s that we had Tholos Tomb 4. There was another Tholos Tomb a little bit further southwest of the palace, Tholos Tomb 3. Tholos 1 and 2 are further down towards the coast, and they're just numbered based on how they were excavated. There was also what appears to have been a grave circle at Pylos as well. So we do have this other burial type. So in 2015, the University of Cincinnati team, still digging at Pylos. Blagan's gone, but it's now directed by Sherry Stalker and Jack Davis. They found, really not that far from Tholos Tomb 4, they found a shaft grave which had not been looted, which they called the Tomb of the Griffin Warrior, based on some of the finds inside of it, which had griffins on them. And it's just a magnificent, magnificent find. It's the first unlooted shaft grave excavated in Greece since Schliemann. It's the richest grave in Greece, probably excavated since the royal tombs of Vergina, the Macedonian kings, Philip II. The gold, 4 gold rings, tons of gold jewelry, his sword, just all kinds of really delightful finds, including the combat agate, which is this tiny little gemstone, about an inch long, carved with a scene of such incredibly intricate detail that it's not clear to me that the ancient Greeks ever were able to do better work than this, even 1,000 years later. It's just the detail on the scale, the musculature, the observance of how things work. The one warrior is grabbing the other's helmet, and you can see where he's holding the crest, the horsehair is pushed down, whereas it's not everywhere else. He's got his sword going down into the guy's neck, and on the ground underneath him, there's another warrior who's dead and just lying there with his arm limply, just exactly how never seen a person lying there dead, but just such observation and such fidelity to the human body on a scale that's how on earth were they carving this? so small way back then. They didn't have, we don't know that they had any kind of magnifying lenses, though people have suggested they might have, and you can see why you would want to suggest that. But it's not clear they had that kind of technology. It seems they may have just been very good at working on a very, very small scale. So this tomb is, this dates to late Helladic 2B, so it's a little bit later than Tholos tomb 4. And one of the big lingering questions is, why is this guy buried in his own shaft grave rather than in Tholos tomb 4, even though it's right there. It's so close to Tholos tomb 4, it must have been a statement that they didn't put him in it. So maybe he's from a rival kin group, maybe a rival dynasty at this point. Like, we don't know, but it's fascinating. And adding to this picture, a couple of years after that, in 2018, and this was only announced about a year ago, they found 2 new Tholos tombs at Pylos, right behind Tholos tomb 4. Literally, you walk over from Tholos tomb 4, you're at Tholos tomb 6, and then you walk a little bit further and you're at Tholos tomb 7. Tholos tomb 6 is even bigger than Tholos 4. Both 6 and 7 have collapsed. 7 is a little bit smaller. And some of the finds they're finding in there, it's I've worked on this excavation, and it's so much fun. It's really incredible. And they found this pendant that came from Egypt that isn't like anything that we've ever seen in the Greek Bronze Age before. So Pylos, which we often tended to think of as kind of a backwater, you go to Mycenean, it has these, the big Cyclopean walls, the treasury of Atreus, everything, the whole citadel. It's incredibly visually impressive. You go to Tiryns and you got these stones that, you need a giant to lift. You go to some of the other, like Medea, which is this fortress on top of a hill near, sort of in between Mycenae and Tiryns, and it's just this visually stunning site. And Pylos, Mycenae is beautiful, and Pylos is in a really striking location on top of the Anglianos Ridge, looking down to the water. And you can see why you'd put a major center there. But the palace itself, so it had this late Helladic 1 fortification wall, but it seems like they probably stopped using it. It's not very well preserved except in one place. And so the palace itself is, the old joke is that archaeology is the study of low-lying walls. And that's kind of what the palace at Pylos feels like. You walk around, and they've really nice the way they display it now. There's this walkway that allows you to get up above the remains, which saves people walking around on top of the walls and damaging it. So really good for conservation and really good for viewing, because you get a better perspective of what the whole thing looks like when you're just that little bit raised and you can see it. But the remains are not viscerally impressive in the way that other sites are. And so, it's often been thought that it's not quite as powerful or quite as important as a site like Mycenae. But what we're seeing now with the Tholos tombs, with the Griffin Warrior tomb, is that at least in the early Mycenaean period, they're playing the same games, they're doing the same things, they're building the same kind of tomb, and they have this connection with Egypt. They have all kinds of wealth coming in. They have a very strong connection with Minoan Crete, which is where we think the combat agate was either made, or either on Crete by Cretan craftsmen or in Pylos by Cretan craftsmen or people trained by them. So they have all these international connections. They have the wealth to build multiple Tholos tombs at the same time, it seems. So Pylos is a really exciting place to be in late Helladic 1, late Helladic 2, the early Mycenaean period.
These rival factions at the top of the Kingdom of Pylos, really vying for power. Do we have any evidence of possibly intercommunal strife because of this?
You feel like it's likely, but that's only based on historical parallels. This is one of those areas where archaeology is infuriating because it's simply bad at telling political historical narratives. So we can find the Griffin Warrior, and we can say so much about him. We can say so much about how he was buried, where he, the stuff he was buried with, the connections of that shows. We can talk about how his identity was being constructed, his social position. There's so much we can say. But when it comes to political narratives, we can say he wasn't buried in tholos 4, and we can say he was buried so close to tholos 4 that it must have been a statement that he was being buried right outside it, but not in it. So, but then basically you're only limited by your ingenuity. Was it like, okay, nobody liked Cousin John, but he's still Cousin John, so he has to have a nice burial somewhere, but we're not going to put him in the nice burial with Grandpa, who would never, disowned him way back when. We don't have those kinds of personal, like if you go over to Hittite Asia Minor, we know all kinds of things about the squabbles in the royal family because the kings wrote things down. And the Myceneans just didn't write history for us in the way that would allow us to reconstruct that sort of those political maneuverings on at the scale of like what happened today and what happened tomorrow. Archaeology can tell you what happened this decade and that decade. It's a sort of a generational game more than a day-to-day thing.
Obviously, they're putting really great stock in burials. You've mentioned the possibility of wishing we knew more about possible cult practices, so on and so forth. My question is now, do we have any insights at all into possibly their religion or religions?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and it's something that we can say some things about and can't say other things about. At Pylos, we have a large Linear B archive. It is the best excavated Linear B archive that we have anywhere, perhaps with the exception of the new finds at Ias Vasilios and Laconia, but those aren't published yet, so they don't count yet. And the new finds from Thebes are also well excavated. But the thing that really makes the Pylos archive unique is that it was all found in situ. So the palace burned down, and the tablets were in the archive rooms. The archive rooms, the wooden shelves collapsed, and the baskets burned, and everything fell down into the middle of the room. But the tablets were found in that room, or in those 2 rooms of the archive room. And then a few others were found scattered throughout the palace, but the bulk of them were found where they were left and where they belonged. And so we can actually assess them in their original archaeological context and within their original, cultural context. And one of the really cool things about visiting Pylos, you study these tablets, you look at pictures of them and you look at the transcribed texts and all of this, and you can tell a lot. But you understand so much more when you actually just get to Pylos. You walk up to the palace, and you come up, and you're looking down at it now, right? Because you've got the platforms. And you're looking down at the entrance, and you see that right to the left of the entrance, literally you can't get past it. You can't get in the palace if you don't walk past this door, is the entrance to the archive room. So they are right there to accost you as soon as you come into the palace. Somebody standing there with his wet clay tablet and his reed stylus saying, "Who are you? Why are you here?" And so we have this great resource for understanding Pylian society, understanding how their kingdom was structured, because they were administering the entire region of, pretty much the entire region of what we now call Mycenae was at least nominally under the control of Pylos. The degree to which the palace actually had complete control over the region is debated. We used to think it controlled literally everything that was happening, but that's pretty facile now. We can see that they were interested in certain things, they were not interested in other things, and so if they were interested in what was going on, they were recording it, but if not, you were free to do your own thing. So that's a whole other discussion. But the tablet, the upshot of this for religion is that we know when the palace was destroyed. So the tablets were, ironically, preserved by the destruction of the palace, because it seems like their record-keeping system it didn't have the same sort of time depth as we find in the ancient Near East. They really only seem to have been concerned with keeping things going from year to year. And so the tablets have reference to the previous year, but there's no real indication that we have any tablets from within the main archive. They're not keeping old documents unless they've transcribed them onto perishable materials such as parchment or papyrus or palm leaves, any kind of thing. Maybe they're doing. We don't really have evidence to suggest that they're doing that either, but it is a real question. Were they writing on perishable materials? But we have these tablets. They weren't fired, so they were probably reused past when they were no longer relevant, right? John comes, tells you about how many sheep he has. You make that new record. You go back, you find John's record of his sheep from last year, and you chuck it back in the pot with the wet clay. Clay is great. You just got to make it wet again, and then it's perfectly reusable. So we have this record of what was happening, this imperfect, incomplete record, but very useful record of what was happening at the palace and throughout the region in the last year of the Pylian kingdom, and only in the last year. So we know in the last year, somewhere a little bit after 1200 BC, we have religious texts, and they tell us, they have a lot of very familiar names. This is one of the significant finds when the Nearby was deciphered, is that Poseidon is a really important god at Pylos. Zeus is an important god. Hera is being worshipped. And so we have a lot of these Olympians whom we would expect to find. We also have some that we would like to see but don't. Apollo doesn't seem to be there. He might be at Knossos. It's not clear. Dionysus is there, which was not expected. So the Greeks of the 5th century were under the impression, and we get this very clearly from Euripides' play The Bacchae, that Dionysus came from the East. They treated him as a kind of Eastern god, a god who was introduced to Greece and had somewhat different expectations of how to live your life than perhaps and this is of course the plot of The Bacchae, which ends with the king of Thebes torn up by his mother. Euripides could really turn up the weird factor when he wanted to. But we find Dionysus here, and we find his name also on Crete, in a context that makes it very clear that this is the god Dionysus and not just some dude who has the name. So we have a lot of Olympians. We don't have, like I said, we don't have Apollo. So we know, we have records of important Pylian sacrificing an ox to Poseidon. And of course, this is incredibly suggestive and evocative, because this is exactly what happens when Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, arrives at Pylos in the Odyssey. He arrives at sandy Pylos, and they're sacrificing a bull on the beach. And you can sit at the beach at Pylos. So Pylos itself, the center, is a few miles from the coast, but there is down on the coast an incredibly sandy beach, perfectly matching Homer's sandy Pylos. And you sit there, and whether Homer knew anything about the Bronze Age or not, he must have known this. He must have known about this beach. And so you sit there, and it's a place that the Myceneans knew about too. There's a tholos tomb on one of the headlands. And so like the site of classical Pylos is on the other headland. So it's this beach in the shape of like an omega or just a crescent, and with these headlands on either side. One was the tholos tomb, one with a cave with various Mycenean finds that Shimon excavated called the Cave of Nestor. No real reason to associate it with Nestor. And it's just this, you sit here and you're like, this is, whether you believe in Homer or not, whether you believe in the Trojan War or not, it's one of those places where you sit and you can just feel the myth around you, and it is so special.
And so when it comes to the Kingdom of Pylos, my question is, do we have any outside sources that tell us about the kingdom?
The short answer is no. The long answer is maybe. The honest answer is it's complicated. It's very complicated. So in terms of understanding the structures of the Pylian kingdom, our best sources are the archaeology from Mycenae, which is it's one of the regions that we understand the best from the Mycenaean period. And this is not only because of the high quality excavations at the site of Pylos itself, starting with Blagan in the 1930s, and as I said, continuing today, and at other major sites. So the site of Iclina on the ridge just over is currently being excavated. It's a really exciting, the finds at Pylos get all the press in the New York Times because they're full of gold and all of this, but Eklina is sort of, from a cultural historic, from the perspective of understanding the Kingdom of Pylos, it's right up there with them in terms of its importance. So we have these major excavations. There's also other site in Nicoria that have been well excavated and are relatively well understood, which is really important. One of the the trouble with the Greek Bronze Age is that we just keep digging up palaces, which, like, you're not going to complain too much. But at the same time, like the Griffin Warrior and the new Tholos tombs at Pylos were discovered by archaeologists who were looking for the lower town. What we really would like to understand better are the people who don't live in palaces, the people who live in smaller centers, the people who live in the lower towns. And you go looking for them and you find a new Tholos tomb. It's tricky. But Pylos has been well served, and Mycenae has been well served by archaeological survey. So obviously, you talk about archaeology, people immediately think that you're in the ground with a pickaxe and a trowel digging up gold. It's not how most archaeology works, but excavation is the backbone of the discipline. But in the later 20th century, it started to become clear to people that surface remains can tell us things about the past. Exactly what they can tell us and how good they are at telling us these things remain issues of interpretation. But nobody within archaeology really disagrees that survey is a really useful tool, not least because it's not invasive, right? Digging, the dirty secret about archaeology is that excavation is destructive. Once you've dug a site, you can't dig it again, right? You've scrambled the egg, you can't unscramble it. And if you do it wrong, you messed up your only shot. And so one of the tensions within archaeology is between a desire to excavate new things and understand new things, and a desire to leave things that can be excavated in the future with new techniques and new methods, when people will be able to do more with the evidence that they find. So it's always, responsible excavations don't dig up everything anymore. They used to, right? Arthur Evans at Knossos, dig it all. The places that he didn't dig are incredibly valuable now because they are the only places where we can test his hypotheses and his arguments based on new excavations. So survey, because it doesn't involve this destruction, is very useful. So the University of Minnesota Mycenean expedition started this off, and then in the 90s, the Pylos Regional Archaeological Project, PRAP, which is, I think, the most amusing acronym in the world, PRAP, did a lot of good work in the region of the Palace of Pylos, exploring the landscape around it and exploring the extent of ancient habitation. And the fun thing with survey is that, if you dig a site, often sites will have, Greece has been inhabited continuously for tens of thousands of years, just about in the right places. But certainly for the last 3,500 years, there's been pretty frequent habitation. And Greece is a rough mountainous country. The places that are good to live are the places that are good to live, and you're going to keep living there. And so a lot of, but what survey does is it allows you to compare habitation patterns throughout time. Because as you're walking along, you could be walking through if you're walking through a site that was really a Mycenean village and then never really inhabited again, you're going to find a lot of Mycenean pottery on the ground, because that's just how things work. But if it was also a classical site, then you're going to find a lot of classical pottery on the ground. If it was a Venetian site, you're going to be finding Venetian pottery. So you can really see what areas were inhabited at this point and at that point. So you can really trace how human interaction with the landscape has changed over massive quantities, vast quantities of time, millennia. And so PRAP really gave us a really strong understanding for how Mycenean culture spread throughout Mycenae. So, we can, by looking at where we find late Helladic 1 pottery versus late Helladic 2 pottery versus late Helladic 3 pottery, we can see where inhabitation is getting more intense and where people are spreading, where they're living at this time versus that time. And we can chart throughout the late Helladic period increasing densities of habitation throughout Mycenae. So as the Kingdom of Pylos is continuing and growing and developing, they're exploiting the landscape in new and more intense ways, and population seems to be growing. Now, all of these interpretations are difficult and can be disputed, right? It's not hard to think of ways that surface finds can be misleading, from from a farmer walking around kicking a sherd from one place to another, to plowing, which can be quite horrific, to any number of other things, the history of habitation. So, but in the large picture, we can definitely paint these pictures based on our survey finds. And we have good reason to think that the conclusions we're drawing from them are broadly accurate. So that tells us one thing about the spread of the Mycenaean kingdom, the spread of the Pelian kingdom, the Mycenean cultural. One of the difficulties with talking about the Greek Bronze Age, especially at this level, is that we use Mycenean to mean mainland Greek late Bronze Age, because Mycenae was the first excavated site and remains the most impressive. And so you can come up with reasons to justify it. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about Pelian culture, Pelian Mycenaean culture, it's or Mycenean Mycenaean culture, it's a mouthful. So that's one way that we can assess the kingdom. The other way, of course, is through the Linear B tablets. And this is our best insight into the kingdom. Supplementing that archaeological evidence is the textual evidence. And as I mentioned already, this is very good, but very limited. And it's important not to overlook the limitations in the excitement at having words, names, places that we recognize. The textual evidence is important, and it's often valued beyond archaeological evidence, because certain types of textual evidence can tell us certain things that archaeology can't, right? Political history, personal beliefs, whether you like your neighbor or not. All these kinds of things come out in text that just don't come out through material culture in the same way. But text is limited in its own ways, and it's important to recognize the limitations that it offers and not to fetishize it above archaeological remains, which has often been done and still is done by some, especially textual scholars. But understanding them together is always the best way forward. So the tablets, like I said, come from the last year of the palace. They don't, beyond what we think we can reasonably extrapolate, they don't tell us anything about 3 years before the palace fell. Now, 3 years before the palace fell, we can be pretty sure that things looked fairly similar, and we can be pretty confident extrapolating it. 50 years previous, 100 years previous, and this is where it gets difficult, because the final collapse of the Pelian state, the final burnt destruction of the palace, happens somewhere just after 1200 BC. The exact dates are hard to reconstruct. It doesn't help that most of the pottery from the palace is undecorated, which makes it particularly difficult to date. But very smart people are pretty sure that it's somewhere at the very beginning of late Helladic 3C, which is, again, early 12th century BC. 100 years before that, the beginning of late Helladic 3B and to late Helladic 3A2, the palace at Pylos is burned down. So the palace we have is this palace that was built at the beginning of late Helladic 3B. And because they rebuilt it on such a large scale, we don't really know much about anything that came before. So, there are pretty good reasons to think that for these 100 years at least, palatial Pylos has a fair degree of continuity. Why it was burned down in 1300 or so, who burned it down, what it looked like before it was burnt down, we don't know. So again, one of those areas where we know something happened, we just can't we don't have the pieces to put it back together. But we know that Linear B was in use before that destruction. So we know there are some tablets that were found built into the walls, basically, of the later palace that definitely don't belong with the main archive. They talk about different people. They're written in an older way. They're written by people who don't write any other tablets. So they clearly don't belong with the main archive that we can see. But within the last 100 years, we can see that the palace has a certain hierarchy of administration and of prestige that seems to combine a religious authority and secular authority. This is one of those things about the ancient world that can be tough to. One of those things about the ancient world that people who study it a lot just sort of wrap their head around eventually and start to take for granted, but that when you're just starting out, it does take some time to get to, which is that, secular and religious authority in a lot of parts of the ancient world were not distinct in the way that we sort of intuitively separate them in our post-Enlightenment world. The concept of a god king, the concept that the pharaoh is somehow responsible for the sun rising each morning. That's something that we don't, it doesn't make much sense to us, but it does seem like this is how society worked in the ancient world. You read Hittite texts, and the king will talk about a victory, and he'll talk about how he won, and all of the storm god and all his friends went before him, and he's winning because the gods are right there helping him. So the idea that these things go alongside each other is perfectly natural. So one of the other troubles with reconstructing this is that our evidence for the specific roles of individual positions within the hierarchy is somewhat shaky. We know the names of the offices, but just like if I gave you a list of military ranks today and asked, to someone who had never had any experience with the army and said, what's the difference between a general and a private? You might be able to figure out, if you had a bit of evidence, that the general has more authority, but how exactly they have more authority, you're not going to. And that's at least knowing that you're within the circumscribed nature of the military. When you have an entire society, if I'm asking someone to compare the Speaker of the House with a lieutenant colonel, if you don't know an awful lot about how that society works and which hierarchy each person fits in, it's very difficult. And that's kind of the game we're playing with the hierarchy of Mycenean Pylos. Sometimes we're more confident than we should be, and that comes down to Homer. So the person who appears to be at the top because they own the most land, it seems, and do various other things, has a title that is Wanox. They are the Wanox. And this title survives into Homer. Onyx on drone Agamemnon. Agamemnon, and pretty much only Agamemnon, is identified as the Onyx, and so the W sound is the kind of sound that gets lost relatively easily in language, and so Greek drops it at some point between Mycenaean. Actually, it gets dropped right before Homer because we can still see its effects in Homer. You need to pretend there's a consonant at the beginning of that word for a lot of verses to scan. It also gets applied to gods like Zeus. And after Homer, it pretty much only applies to gods. And so in tragedy, it's basically just a word used for gods. It does pop up in a few other places. But even Homer seems a little bit unsure on what exactly this word means. He just knows that it's an important title and it's part of this formula, which is preserved for Agamemnon, an oxandron Agamemnon, which goes back to how we understand Homeric poetry to have been composed out of formulae, which survived in some cases. In some cases, it seems like the exact sequence of words that Homer is using are as many as maybe 700 or 800 years older than the poems themselves. So this oral tradition has some real depth to it in certain places. And the preservation of the word onox or wanox is one of them. And so Well, what does Agamemnon do? He leads the Greek forces to Troy. So what does the Mycenean Wanox do? Well, he must have been the king, just like Agamemnon. He must have been in charge of the armies. He must have done all these things. Boom, exact, great. We understand the Wanox. Moving on. Maybe not. So the Wanox does certain things, seems to be the most important person in the kingdom, but reconstructing perfectly the nature of their secular authority, the nature of their religious authority, is very difficult. We also have a person called the Lawagetos, a word which doesn't survive in Homer, partially because the shape of the metrical form of the word doesn't work well with Homer's poetry. It does pop up in Pindar and in lyric poetry a tiny bit, but it seems mostly to have been forgotten. You can analyze this word. It seems to come from the Greek word laos, or laos, which means people or perhaps army, plus the Greek verb ago, to lead. So he's the leader of the laos, which might be the army. So he might be the leader of the army. The trouble is we don't have any text where he's actually marshaling troops or leading an expedition. So this is one of those things where, because we understand the Greek language, we can guess at etymological interpretations. But etymology is not always a sure guide for how things work. So unless we have contextual evidence from the Linear B tablets, if we can only rely on etymology, it's better than just nothing, but it is still a form of conjecture. Everything's a form of conjecture, really, but it's a weaker form of conjecture if you can't actually point to people doing things. And then we have a bunch of other positions in the kingdom that don't get remembered at all. And again, they sort of have Greek meanings, but not ones that are really helpful. So we have the Damokoros. And in this word, we have the word damos, which in Attic is demos, which gives us demokratia, which is democracy. So we have the people, but we don't know who the people are. Maybe local landholders. It seems they pop up a little bit, the damos. They're able to sort of dispute things with the palace, which is interesting. There's a tax dispute that we have recorded over what kind of taxable land a priestess holds. She says one thing, the damos says another. And so one of the things that we've learned recently, and this comes mostly from the work of Dimitri Nikosis at the University of Colorado now, is that while we have palatial records, and so we understand the palace well, one of the things that we've done historically is overestimate the power and importance of the palace, the palatial hierarchy, and the palatial offices. So he looked at all of the people named in the Pelian tablets, and he found that a lot of people who have names but no office seem to actually be really important. There's a lot of people that the palace are dealing with who control wealth and resources in Mycenae, but aren't holding a specific office given to them by the palace. We also have, these groups like the Damos, which it just means the people. It's probably older than the palace, which is able to dispute things. So they have a certain authority and power, probably independent of the palace, and they're probably, contending with the palace in some ways. So there's alternative hierarchies within the kingdom that aren't not just what we see in the palace. We also have one of the trickiest things to interpret. So the classical Greek word for king is basileus. And this really, by the time you get to 5th century tragedy, this word absolutely means king, only king and nothing but king. And it is the word for king. It's the word that, if you're talking about the Persian king, he is the king. Often just the king. You don't even have to say from Persia because we know who the king is. Greeks didn't really have their own kings much until Alexander. This word is in Homer, but it doesn't have quite the same force there because we still have this memory of the Wanox who's on top, and Basileus in Homer seems to mean something closer to chieftain or lord. You have a bunch of them and they're all important, but it's not clear who's more important than the others. And whereas the Onox, there seems to be this idea that there is only one. When we go back to Mycenean, we have a word that will become basileus. It's got a different sound. Sound changes will affect it. And these people, it's not clear that it's a palatial office, and it's not really clear what these people are doing or that they're really that important within the palatial hierarchy. So we have to explain somehow how we go from a system where the Guazalewes are just regional potentates, big men, something, to a period where that becomes the word for king. Now, what is generally used to explain this is that one of the strange things about the Greek Bronze Age is that after the palaces are destroyed, memories of them are foggy and unclear. Like I say, there's a lot of palatial offices, the curator, the procurator, that just don't survive. And there's others like the Lawagetos, which survives in scattered references in Pindar, but wouldn't be able to say anything about it just from that. Even the position of the Wanox, what he really did is basically forgotten by Homer's time. He just uses, he knows Agamemnon's important, and so obviously this word is important because it's associated with him. So the idea, and we also have especially a goddess. One of the most important goddesses at Pylos is Potnia, and her name means mistress. Just transparently, that's what it means, the mistress. And she appeared, what exactly she is not clear. There's a lot of epithets she receives, and it's not always clear if she is, if it's a different version of Potnia every time she gets an epithet, or if it's the same Potnia in a different aspect. Just like, the Catholic Church has so many epithets for the Virgin Mary, but she's still one woman. Versus whether is the Asian Potnia different from the horsey Potnia? We don't know. We also have a Potnia of Athens, attested at Knossos. Now, it's not clear that the Athens here is the Athens on the mainland. There are other places in Greece called Athens. It's an old name from this substrate language that may have obviously meant something to people once. But it's possible that this Potnia of Athens then becomes the goddess that we know as Athena. So that it's possible that we have that. And so that's a sort of survival of this idea of the mistress. And if that's the case, then maybe it suggests that the Potniae of different places are in fact different goddesses. One of the reasons this is so hard to reconstruct is because after the Bronze Age collapse, we don't get text again until Homer, and Homer has no idea who Potnia is. She doesn't appear at all. It's just not. So she's just gone. So a lot of really important things from the Bronze Age have just disappeared. And this has always been tough for people who want to see real Bronze Age memories. In Homer, it's like, why does he not remember the palatial bureaucracy? I mean, partially because he's telling a war story and nobody cares about what the vice mayor of some small town in Messenia was doing, how many goats he had. But you would really like for him to remember big things like the woman who seems to be the most important goddess in the realm. So that's tough. So we have this really almost complete forgetting of a lot of palatial culture. And so it seems like what might have happened is that when the palace collapses and its entire power structure collapses with it, the sort of most senior people who avoid this collapse are the Basileus, the kings. So these chieftains, with this word that means, chieftain, all of a sudden they look around and the palace is burned down and the Wanox is dead and all of his vice mayors and regional governors are all gone. It's like, I'm in charge now. And so it might be that simple, that these people who were sort of part of an alternative hierarchy that wasn't based on palatial authority, when the palace collapsed, were able to take over more authority to themselves, and then eventually, go from chieftains, big men, local potentates, all the way to the place where the word used to describe them means king, because they were able to accrue that much power for themselves over the generations. So that's what sources from the kingdom itself can tell us, the archaeology, the texts. Now, the question of whether anybody from outside the Greek world ran into these people is a difficult one. In some ways, it's pretty clear that yes, we know from trade, from material culture, that they're interacting with Egypt, they're interacting with Anatolia, with further east. We know stuff is going there, stuff is coming back. Textual records from outside of Greece are a little bit more complicated. And part of this is because textual records. So from Egypt, we have references to a people called the Tanai. The Tanai, my Egyptian isn't very good. And so this word is very similar to one of the words that Homer uses for the Greeks. One of the things that people who read Homer will know is that he never uses the word Greek. He talks about the Achaeans and he talks about the Danaans, but he doesn't talk about the Greeks. And in fact, the Greeks never called themselves the Greeks. Homer almost never even uses the word that the Greeks did use for themselves, Hellenes, which is still what modern Greeks call themselves, or is what modern Greeks call themselves again. Whole history is a whole thing. But he doesn't usually, he uses these sort of tribal names, the Achaeans and the Danaans. And so Tanai, this Egyptian word, looks and sounds like Danaan and might be. And we know that Cretans, Minoan Cretans, sent deputations to various pharaohs. And we know this because there are paintings of them carrying very Minoan-looking pottery, bull's head raita, things that really only come from Crete, wearing clothes with Cretan patterns on them, painted on the tombs of various 18th century various 18th dynasty dignitaries, like Rekmir Ra, who's the vizier of Thutmose III for a while. And it seems like this continues into the period once Myceneans have arrived on Crete. So it looks like they're still doing that. We also know that from the annals of Thutmose III that he meets Tanai in Syria. So are these Greek mercenaries, something like this? We don't know. We also know that Amenhotep III at his mortuary temple has a statue base with a list of places that look a lot like places in the Greek world. So especially the name Mycenae seems to really stand out on that list, along with Knossos and a few others. And any one of them on their own, you might say, well, this could be anywhere. But the fact that they appear together really suggests that perhaps a joint embassy came from the Greek lands to Egypt in this period. Eric Klein has also suggested that this represents the itinerary of a royal embassy of the pharaoh to Greece. I'm not an Egyptologist. I'm not really competent to assess whether that's likely. I think a deputation from Greece is a simpler assumption to make based on what we know about tribute and these exchanges which happen with Egypt. Egypt does this fun thing where you send an embassy with a bunch of gifts. And the pharaoh says, thank you, you have given me tribute. I am the king of the world and I accept this. And then quietly, he actually does send reciprocal gifts back, but this doesn't get recorded. So all the propaganda shows everybody coming and giving the pharaoh stuff. None of the propaganda shows that he's, it's part of these exchange patterns. So one of the difficulties in interpreting ancient texts, especially, our texts are often royal documents because kings are the people who have access to scribes and literate folk. And so often, their stories are going to be about how great they are, and they're not going to account for everything. So we have some references to the Greek world from Egypt in their texts. Figuring out where in the Greek world, outside of this list of place names, is very difficult. And that difficulty is felt especially when we look at Hittite records. Now, the Hittites were another late Bronze Age power, really a much bigger power, right? You could fit Mycenae inside their capital like 50 times. It's huge. Everything happening in the Near East makes the Greeks look like villagers. Even the Mycenaeans in their palaces, really, they are not competing with what's happening in Anatolia and the Near East in this period, or really ever until Alexander. And even then, he can conquer it, but then he sort of keeps it the way he found it. And then Egypt, it's not an accident that Ptolemy goes to Egypt after Alexander dies. It's not an accident that Seleucus goes to Babylon. These are the places where power is in the ancient world. It's not even an accident that before the War of Actium, Antony goes to the east. And it seems like that's the place to be. And the fact that Octavian is actually able to win from Rome over Antony in the east is surprising. That's not what you would have guessed. Antony gets to go hang out in Alexandria, probably the most cultured city in the world at this point, whatever you want that to mean. Whereas Octavian has to hang out in Italy and deal with piracy and all these problems. So the ancient Near East is always the place where things are happening. All you have to do is look at the Battle of Marathon and Thermopylae. The Greeks are thrilled just to have held them off. The great king comes to the edge of the world, and all these local villagers are able to band together and hold him off. And hooey, that's great. But even after that, you read the history of the Peloponnesian War, and the Spartans are able to win in part because they get access to Persian funding for their own navy. Persia does not go away. So this is true even in the Bronze Age, that the Near East is where things are really happening and going on. And, when we look at the Mediterranean, when we look at our maps of the Bronze Age, we kind of center Greece because, disciplinary boundaries and the amount of knowledge you have to have in order to say anything. There are good reasons to focus on a specific region, but really our maps should be centered on, Iran or Iraq, probably Mesopotamia, with Iran to the east and Greece off in the corner. I do this exercise with my students where I zoom in and out of a map and sort of show them where, how we should be thinking about these things. And we should not be thinking of Greece in the middle of anything. It's on the edge. It's a fascinating region. It has many great remains, many good reasons to want to study it. But it's peripheral to a lot of the things that are really happening in this time period. And so the Hittites are another late Bronze Age kingdom in central Anatolia, modern Turkey. Their capital is, I think, about 100 miles east of Ankara, at a site called Hattusa. And they have great kings. And this is a formal title that they use, that the Great Powers Club get to use with themselves. If you're the pharaoh, you're a great king. If you're the king of Hatti, you're a great king. If you're the king of Babylon, you're a great king. If you're not a great, you can also be a king. So a great king is really a very limited club. And so the Hittite Empire ranges really at its greatest extent from the western shore of Turkey, the Aegean coast, down into Syria. And they're fighting with the Egyptian pharaohs at the Battle of Kadesh and things like this. That's how strong and powerful they are. They're contending openly with Egypt and regions outside of both of their own homelands. And so because they have interests in Western Anatolia, they come very close to dealing with the Greek world. We know that the Greek world, in the historical period, the Greek world very much includes Western Asia Minor. In fact, the Greek world included parts of Turkey up until 1922, when it was very violent, when there was this violent upheaval of Greek speakers in Turkey after the failed Asia Minor expedition. But that was always part of the Greek world, and it seems like that the idea of the Aegean world, the east coast of the Aegean, is not fundamentally cut off from the Greek mainland or the other islands. So sites like Miletus have strong Minoan connections, strong Mycenean connections. The islands like Rhodes, Rhodes, Samos, Lesbos, cities like Ephesus, they're always part of this Western's the wrong word, part of this Aegean culture. And so when the Hittites are getting to Western Asia Minor, they should be running into Greeks. We'd expect them to be running into Bronze Age Greeks because that's, we know the Mycenaeans Mycenean material cultures attested at Miletus and other places in the West. There's lots of Mycenean pottery at Troy, right? So it's right there. They're dealing with it. So the Hittites deal with various challengers, basically. Being based in Central Asia Minor, it's hard for them to control exactly what's happening on the western coast. The geography of Turkey is difficult, and this is the ancient world. You don't have like F-15s, you can fly over people. Chariots are quick, but they're not that quick. So ensuring things like the loyalty of vassals is really important. And we get a lot of this from the Hittites. Coming out west, dealing with uprisings when they happen, mounting punitive expeditions when they need to make an impression, installing vassal rulers whom they think will be loyal. And so, we have a treaty between the Hittite king and the king of Troy, or the king of Walusa, the site that we call Troy. The king of Walusa in this treaty, his name is Alexandru, which is Alexander. Now, Paris is the Trojan prince who abducted Helen, but those who have read the Iliad or have a good memory will recall that his other name is Alexandros, Alexander. So this is one of those things that goes really beyond the realm of coincidence. The fact that we have a king at Walusa named Alexandru, and then he gets demoted to a prince in Homer, but we can easily see how he could have been a king in an earlier version of the story, named Alexander, starts the Trojan War. So that, at least in Homer, is real. That is a real historical memory of a historical person who lived in Troy. Now, did he judge the beauty of 3 different goddesses and then go and steal Helen of Troy from Sparta? No. But there's something there. So in all of these dealings with Western Asia Minor, the Hittites in their letters make reference to people called the Ahiawans and a region called Ahiawa. Now, just like in Egypt, where we have the Tanai, which sounds like Danaan, Ahiawa sounds like Achaia, which is the other word that Homer uses for the Greeks. So, are the Ahiawans the Mycenean Greeks? Yes. There's basically no way to get around this. They're in the right place. If we assume that they aren't, then we have to ask, okay, where do we put them archaeologically? Who actually are these people? And then why are the Mycenaeans, who are right here, why do they not appear in the Hittite records at all? So we have a few texts that deal with the activities of Ahiawans. There's this character called Atarisius, who people really want to be Atreus, the father of Agamemnon, but it just doesn't work. You can't contort it that much. But he has a fun time. He raids Cyprus with 100 chariots, and he seems to be some sort of military adventurer. It's not clear. Unfortunately, the language that the Hittites use here is not clear whether he's a king of Ahiawa or just an agent. They just say man of Ahiawa, which could mean king, could not. We also have letters to the great king. We also might have a letter from the king of Ahiawa to the Hittite king. Unfortunately, the preamble is really damaged, so it's very hard to be sure. But we know that the letters tell us that Miletus is under Ahiawan control, which, since we know Miletus has these strong Mycenean connections in the material culture, is pretty good confirmation that we're right in thinking what we do when we say that the Ahiawans are Mycenean Greeks. And we know that the Hittite king calls the king of Ahiawa a great king. So he gets to be part of this club. The difficulty is that we don't really get the impression that the Hittite king knows much at all about the king of Ahiawa. And calling him a great king might just be a diplomatic thing. The Hittites, I don't believe, had any kind of Mediterranean navy. They had no real capacity or interest, it seems, in going west into the Aegean. So if someone who was causing them trouble had fled into the Aegean, and this is the kind of thing that we see happening. If they want him back, they kind of have to ask nicely. It's not clear that they really know who they're asking. I mean, they know they're asking the king. Unfortunately, they never name him, which would be really nice. And it's really not clear what's happening with Ahiawa, right? So the Greek mainland, it's not clear. No, so the linear B evidence for Pylos is pretty clear that Pylos is independent. You can squint and struggle and try and read it in a way that it's not independent. And you can say that, maybe 50 years earlier, if things were different, maybe it wasn't independent back then. But it's pretty clear that the tablets we have tell the story of an independent kingdom. So the idea that we have a unified Greece, a unified great kingdom of Mycenean Greece, is very difficult. There are still people who argue for this, and they have reasons for it, but it's not especially the tablets where we have our best evidence for political structure is at Pylos. And what Pylos tells us is that we do not have a unified mainland. Now, could we see something like what the narrative of Troy preserves, which is a confederation of different independent polities and kingdoms coming together to do things in Asia Minor? Yes, and it's perhaps plausible that we see that happening at various points. But the idea that the Hittites refer to a great king of Ahiawa, and this must mean that just because the Hittite king thinks there's a great king does not necessarily mean there was actually a great kingdom. It just means that there was someone who was powerful in the Aegean that he wanted a powerful person in the Aegean to do him a favor. And the question of whether the king of Ahiawa is at Mycenae or Thebes, or someone has recently suggested Pylos. Now, the reason that they suggest Pylos is because we know a lot about what's happening at Pylos. The reason we know a lot about what's happening at Pylos is because we have linear B text there. So we know Pylos has a navy. We have records of rowers and things like this. We can be pretty sure that Mycenae had a navy too. We just don't have tablets that tell us that. So if your only criterion is what region actually tells us what it has, then Pylos is, of course, going to be an obvious suggestion. It's not clear that Pylos is anywhere nearly as powerful as somewhere like Knossos on Crete or Mycenae, just because the wealth and the power manifest at Mycenae and the remains there suggests that it's doing something different. And the whole Argolid, so the whole plain, Tiryns is right on the coast, or was right on the coast, now is still very close to the coast. Massive fortified citadel. Medea, just above it, just a little bit to the north on top of a hill, massive fortified citadel. Argos is the tricky one because this is the site that became a successful classical city. So were there Mycenaean remains there? Yes. What do they look like? We don't really know. But almost certainly massive fortified citadel. You come further up the plain, you come around the hill, Mycenae sitting there, massive fortified citadel. There's this whole landscape of power, right? As soon as you land at Tiryns and you look up at those walls, these Cyclopean walls, and you look up behind it to the north and you see Tiryns, and you look off to the west and you see Argos, and then your deputation travels up north and you go around the hills, and then you see Mycenae all of a sudden come glaring down at you from the hills. Like, this is theater. They're doing, so it's not actually clear that the Argolid is a unified kingdom. There are people who will argue that it isn't. I think they're wrong. I think it's very clearly a unified thing, and that all of these fortresses are working together to send a message. And I think this message is aimed at people in the East. I think, the Mycenaeans, perhaps literally, Myceneans from Mycenae, were present at Troy. I think they saw the walls of Troy and they thought, wow, that's what a city looks like. And so the Argolid gets monumentalized, and really with an eye to people coming from the East. So if this is a center of Ahiawa, right, you want the messenger of the great king of Hatti, the great Hittite king, to come and land at Tiryns and see your big walls and your big fortresses and come to Mycenae and be impressed by your gold and your splendor. And I think that the monumentalization of the Argolid is really the great attempt of the Mycenean world to look like they belong in the club of great powers. They don't, right? They're so much smaller, but I think this is really where they're really putting it on. And so I think this is why I would think that Mycenae and the kingdom of the Argolid is the capital of Ahiawa, but it does so for all of that. It doesn't really tell us anything about Pylos because, as far as we can tell, Pylos is independent.
Now I want to talk about the Bronze Age collapse. How does the Bronze Age collapse affect Pylos?
Basically, it collapses it. The Pylos, all of the major palatial centers in Greece, with the possible exception of Athens, get burned down. We don't know why. We don't know by whom. One of the great questions is what is happening, and just political history. Politics and history are happening in ways that we can't see. People have suggested that we have big earthquakes, which is certainly possible. But the difficulty with an earthquake is that there's lots of earthquakes in Greece, and we can see their effects throughout the Bronze Age. More often than not, 95% of the time, if there's an earthquake, people rebuild. So just saying we had a bunch of earthquakes doesn't tell us why things didn't just keep going how they were. Because, if you have a strong society, you have an earthquake, a building falls over, you put it back up. So maybe earthquakes or something like this, natural disasters, exacerbated existing issues. It might be, the scholars have suggested that there was a period of drought, a period of difficulty, and so society was not able to deal with things like natural disasters in the way that it normally would. It was already weakened and susceptible to disruption. And then so it may have just been too many things stacking on top of each other. It seems like there were population movements in this point, which is understandable, right? If you're in Mycenean Pylos and all of a sudden something happens and your palace is burned down, you can see why maybe that might not be where you want to live anymore. And if you and your whole village, the men in your village are like, ouchie, yeah, we're going to go try our luck on Cyprus, which seems to still be doing its thing. And so there is this idea of a sort of domino effect, where as regions get destabilized and collapse, people, refugees, mercenaries, people looking for a change, travel to new regions. They also disrupt those new regions, and this is sort of the sea people theory, which is really difficult. So we know that the king Ramses II of Egypt in the early 12th century fought off what he describes as a confederation of people from everywhere, and they were terrifying. They were tall as giants and had big fangs and really sharp swords, and only the great heroic pharaoh could actually defeat them. And wasn't it great that the accounts we have are royal propaganda? But people look at the names of the people that he says he defeated: the Ekwesh, which looks like Achaeans, the Sardinoi, which looks like Sardinians, the Sekelesh, I think, which looks like Sicilians. So people have suggested that this represents some kind of the Peliset, which looks like Philistines. So people have suggested that this is some kind of pan-Mediterranean group of roving wanderers who have their own lands have collapsed and they've come to try their chances in Egypt or something like this. And people have said, because this is really the one thing we can hang our hat on, right, is we have this big battle in Egypt with people who look like they may have been affected by collapse. And so people have suggested that these people are responsible for everything. The sea peoples they came along and they sacked Cyprus and they sacked Ugarit and they sacked the Hittite capital Hattusa somehow, even though it's nowhere near the sea. So even if there's a degree of truth in that, even if some of the people who may have really been more refugees than invaders that Ramses II was able to fight off, even if they were refugees from other disrupted regions, doesn't really tell us why those regions were disrupted. And it's very hard, it's very easy in some ways to assume that the one group of people we know who were responsible for conflict in this period were in fact responsible for all the conflicts. But it's very actually hard to defend that if someone asks, if you kind of sit back and think about it. So the idea that the sea people are in an unmotivated way, in any kind of simplistic way, responsible for the collapse doesn't hold up. So, this is not my personal area of expertise, but we don't know what happened, and we are not likely to know, because what happened came out of history. Historical forces, political forces came together and led to a series of burnt destructions on the Greek mainland. They led to an invasion of Egypt that may or may not be related. They led to destruction on Cyprus and in the Near East that, again, it's easier to assume that all of these things are related than not, but the chronology is not always easy too. So it seems like what happened is, over the space of 50 to 100 years, the whole region of the Eastern Mediterranean was destabilized. People were moving around, things were happening, cities were burning for reasons that we can't really reconstruct. And it's a long, some cities seem to have held out longer, some cities didn't hold out as long. Now, I was at a lecture last year where someone said, the chronology is really tough. It's really hard to synchronize all these destructions, which means we didn't have a collapse. And I said, well, if we have a period of 50 to 100 years with a whole lot of disruption and chaos and burning, isn't that sort of a more realistic narrative of collapse than just all of a sudden everything gets burned down? He said, no, if it doesn't happen at the same time, it can't be a collapse, which I think there's something to his argument that these things are hard to synchronize. But in fact, I think a long period of instability leading to a series of collapses, this isn't unlike what we would sort of talk about in the Western Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries as things, there's no one simple, easy collapse of Rome. There's a whole lot of things that go wrong. There's the loss at Adrianople. There's the Gothic sack in 410. There's a whole, it keeps going. Collapse is never simple. And so coming back to Greece and to Pylos, the thing that people have hung their hat on in Greece, again, based on later myth, is this story of the Dorian invasion and the return of the children of Heracles. Now, one of the difficulties that anybody trying to reconstruct what happened faces is not dissimilar to something we spoke about before, and that is the linguistic situation before and after the collapse. Mycenean Greek is it is not the ancestor of all forms of Greek spoken in later Greece. It is perhaps the ancestor of one of them, but it has changes in it already that rule out, it's already distinct from other dialects, and especially Doric. So Doric preserves some older sounds. Mycenean Greek has already changed these, and they don't change back. So we know that Mycenean Greek is being written, at least, presumably spoken, at Pylos, at Mycenae, at Knossos, at Thebes, in Laconia now, at Aias Vasilios, at Volos, everywhere where we have linear B, right? A lot of these regions, Crete and the whole Peloponnese, so Pylos and Mycenae and Tiryns and Argos and Medea, the whole Argolid, in the historical period, these are Doric-speaking regions. So when did the Dorians arrive? And how did they arrive? Is a question that we have to face. Now, the idea that at the end of the Bronze Age, these sort of northern Greek hill tribesmen came sweeping down into the Peloponnese and burned everything down and destroyed all the palaces is, you'd like it to be true because it fits with the myths, and it's a fun story, right? But it's just, this is not how we understand that populations moved in the ancient world. If you want to live somewhere, it makes much more sense to find a nice local girl and marry her, or vice versa, than to go and burn it down, right? Like, that's just, we have this notion of barbarians, which I think comes more from like Asterisk and Obelisk than from real history, because like people, this is the thing, with the end of the Roman Empire too, right? The Goths want to be Roman. They want to be Romans. The Germanic tribes want in. That's what's happening. They don't want to burn it down. So the idea that these hill tribes who can't really speak Greek right came down and took everything over and burned things down while they were doing it, that they were responsible for it all, is really tough. Now, were there population movements that led to Northern Greeks entering the Peloponnese? Probably. Were they already there as a lower class? This has been suggested. Just because we see one form of Greek being written doesn't mean that is the only form of Greek that was being spoken. The United States keeps its official records in English. That does not mean that there are people in America who do not speak English. And this is very clear in other regions, in other times. We know that most people in Asia Minor weren't speaking Hittite at a time when Hittite was being used to keep records. The Persians in the historical period were, they were keeping their records in Elamite, which is not the old Persian language, not related to the modern Persian language. So were they already there? Maybe. We don't know. And any narrative of simplistic invasion is going to be wrong. But we do know that the palace was sacked. We do know that the tholos tombs were looted violently when they were excavated in the 50s. The bones were just scattered everywhere, and the excavator, writes in the publication that he can only assume that people who really did not like these people came in and dug up the burials and threw bones everywhere and violently despoiled these burials. So it has been suggested that the collapse in Greece is some kind of Marxist class revolution. The downtrodden Dorians who are just really tired of all these palatial people telling them what to do, rise up and burn down the palace and sack the tombs and start speaking their own language freely again. Which, again, the trouble with all of this is that we have so few fixed points. We have a burnt palace. We have a changing linguistic situation. You're really only limited by your ingenuity when it comes to reconstructing the actual events that led to this. And, academics are clever people. There's no shortage of ingenuity when it comes to all of this. So in some things, I think it's best to step back and say, I don't know. And when it comes to the Bronze Age collapse, that might be the biggest one.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight at the Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. As always, I am your host, Nick Barksdale, and Theodore Nash took us on a journey through the rise and fall of the Kingdom of Pylos. We explored a variety of subjects, from primary sources to archaeology to tombs to religion, language, writing systems, and even the very beginning with the indigenous populations who eventually become consumed by those that came in after. Theodore Nash, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Nick. It was great to chat.
To my subscribers, don't forget to check out the links in the video description below. It's going to take you to a variety of sources to where you can look at his work and really take advantage of all the awesome things that Mr. Nash has to offer, and I can't recommend it enough. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much, and have a wonderful night.